Native American stories tend to go unspoken in our nation's history. Since Columbus's arrival to the Americas in 1492, Native Americans have been at the hand of the white man. As Europeans began settling on these lands, they faced what they coined the Indian problem, constant run-ins with the native peoples that have been living there for centuries. Beginning in the early 1800s, the now established United States began brainstorming solutions to this so-called Indian problem. Some believed in proper assimilation of the native peoples, while others desired full expulsion. In any case, the Indian problem stood in the way of American Western expansion. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, which began the infamous Trail of Tears. Native Americans were marched, often at gunpoint, off their homelands and onto designated areas west of the Mississippi. In 1851, Congress passed the Indian Appropriations Act, which created the reservation system. In 1887, the Dawes Act reinforced the reservation system. The nominal purpose of the Dawes Act was to protect the property of the natives, as well as to compel their absorption into the American mainstream. With this, the U.S. government tried to divide up native land and give private ownership to native families, as encouragement to enter the white man's world. However, as notable Lakota leader Sitting Bull once said, "If the Great Spirit had desired me to be a white man, he would have made me to be so in the first place." As part of the assimilation process in the late 1800s, the United States began creative Native American-specific boarding schools. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the flagship Indian boarding school in the United States from its foundation in 1879 through 1918. Though many of these schools began popping up around the country, the most prominent three were the Carlisle Indian School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, the Haskell Indian School in Lawrence, Kansas, and the Sherman Indian School in Riverside, California. On October 6, 1879, the first Native American students arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The school was created by former Civil War officer Richard Henry Pratt on a former military site. His army had also previously cleared the western frontier of inhabitants and resistors during periods of western expansion. Pratt had also experimented with Native American education by practicing various methods on Indian military prisoners in Florida. Pratt believed Indians could be assimilated into white American society if they were given proper vocational and religious training. In 1892, Pratt wrote, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. In a sense, I agree with this sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in them and save the man." Pratt considered this to be a very liberal point of view for the time period. The United States government believed that these schools were their last-ditch effort to solve their Indian problem. They decided to target the children in hopes that future generations of Native Americans would be able to more easily assimilate. Today, Native American people are survivors of genocide as defined by the United Nations. For these boarding schools, children were ripped away from their parents, sometimes by force, and sent on long train rides to faraway lands. The white men came to reservations, promised a better future for the children, and coaxed parents into giving their children over to this schooling system. However, once at the schools, an immediate transformation began. Children were no longer allowed to speak in their native languages or practice their religious rituals. Upon arrival, they were stripped of their native dress and put in white man's clothing. Next, they received haircuts. The natives often took pride in their long hair, as it was traditionally a symbol of strength, wisdom, and dignity. Then the children were swept into a schooling system that was run like a military. School leaders believed that the only way to control the children and teach them properly was to separate and isolate them from the blanket of their parents. Students also faced harsh treatment and punishments, overcrowding, rapid spread of disease, and emotional and physical and sometimes sexual abuse. There have been over 6,000 child deaths recorded in Indian residential schools, though most probably went unrecorded. Most families never saw the bodies of their children, and many were buried in unmarked graves. Only 10% of students graduated from Carlisle throughout the years, whether it be that they left the school or died while there. These residential schools still grew rapidly despite being problematic. In 1902, there were 25 federally funded non-reservation schools with about 6,000 students. By 1973, about 60,000 students were enrolled in Indian-specific residential schools.
My name is Chris Gavaler. I'm a professor of English, and I've written a novel about the Carlisle Indian School called School for Tricksters.
I'm Deborah, Miranda, member of the Ohlone, Costanoan, Estland Nation from the greater Monterey Bay area of California.
Important thing to understand, though, about the Carlisle School of the 19-teens versus the Carlisle School of the beginning in the 1880s, really drastically different kinds of places, both deeply corrosive. The early school was an unqualified nightmare. It was cultural genocide, and also often physical genocide because the death toll was incredibly high. Children taken from their parents, forced to live hundreds of miles away. Carlisle's in Pennsylvania. These are Plains Indians, children being moved across the country, so there was no possibility of them escaping from the campus and ending up anywhere that would get them home again.
They removed children from their communities and kept them for like up to 10 years. And they also lost their connection many times to the land that they came from. And most tribes, if not all tribes, had a very deep attachment to land. So those tribes that did still have land, I think that was really unfortunate. So what it did was it created a break in the generations that was very difficult to, if not impossible, to mend.
So it was an absolutely unqualified, brutal institution that then became the norm for the entire Indian school system. Absolutely genocidal. By 1912, it is still a horrific place, but the kinds of horrific have changed in those decades. At that point, some former students have become employees of the school, working as staff, working as faculty. By 1912, 19-teens, the U.S. government has shifted its attitude about Native America from extermination to this paradoxical desire to preserve its final remnants.
If children did return to their homes, oftentimes they no longer spoke the language that their parents spoke, and they couldn't communicate with their parents anymore. And in the same way, they could no longer participate in any cultural or religious rituals. So they really did become people who were stuck in the in-between, because they were also, no matter how trained or how highly polished they were, they would never be accepted or fit into white culture either. And the jobs that they were supposedly trained for were impossible for them to get, but also they were trained on old, out-of-date machines. And so when they went to apply for jobs, they were faced with equipment they had never seen before. For example, the boys who had been trained as printers, or the girls who had been trained as seamstresses. Sometimes they were just trained to sew by hand, and they were confronted with sewing machines. So the schools that, even the schools that did train students, didn't do a very good job of training them.
Its goal was to destroy Indian communities. You could make the argument that it helped individuals, which was part of the program. The idea was to turn tribes into sets of individuals who could be acclimated to quote-unquote white America.
However, some individuals flourished as a result of the Native American boarding schools. For example, Jim Thorpe graduated from Carlisle and is now known as one of the best American athletes of all time. After Carlisle, he went on to play professional baseball, basketball, and football, and won Olympic medals in track and field.
Jim Thorpe is arguably the most famous person to go to Carlisle, extremely well known, considered the best athlete of the first half of the 20th century, particularly in football, but also as an Olympic track star. Here you have an individual who did benefit immensely individually, but he left his community and became a national figure. And he was not primarily working with his tribes. He was gaining individual success, and he was taught to do that as part of the quote-unquote American dream. The American project is individualization. So even specific Native individuals who benefited, their communities did not benefit as communities.
Though most of the schooling proved to be ineffectual, the curriculum often did succeed in teaching natives the English language. With this, tribes were brought together and for the first time were put under the same roof with the same language. This allowed for a new type of bonding between native tribes and the formation of a Pan-American native identity.
I think the biggest help that boarding schools were for Native people in general, they taught everybody the same language. Native people were really oftentimes separated, tribes were separated by distance or geography, and so they may have spoken 3 or 4 different languages, but that was it. And so it was impossible to form any kind of coalition or any kind of stable pushback to colonization, because each tribe was pretty much acting on its own. So learning English was something that gave us the concept of being pan-Indian, actually the concept of being Indian at all. Everybody was just their individual tribes for so long. And then the idea that there was an us came out of speaking English. So that was a huge plus. It allowed people to communicate with each other, sometimes across the continent, and sometimes even with other indigenous people in other countries. So that was a big help.
Zitkala-Sa, native of the Yankton Dakota Sioux tribe, attended a native boarding school. At the age of 8 years old, she arrived at White's Indiana Manual Labor Institute in Wabash, Indiana. She remained there for 3 years before returning home, but her time there proved to be formational. In her later writings, she described both the deep misery of having her heritage stripped away when she was forced to pray as a Quaker and cut her traditionally long hair. By contrast, she took joy in learning how to read and write and play the violin. At the age of 15, Zitkala-Sa chose to return to White's Indiana Manual Labor Institute in search of more education. She continued with her English proficiency and even began to teach the violin to younger girls. At the age of 23, Zitkala-Sa took a position at Carlisle as a music teacher in 1899. While here, she began her writing career by publishing a short story collection, Old Indian Legends. The book was aimed at children and hoped to instill Native American values and traditions in its readers. This began her pushback against the native boarding school system. As an educator, Zitkala-Sa was supposed to be working with the assimilation mission of the Carlisle School. However, Zitkala-Sa had seen the inadequacies of this education. Often, these boarding schools left children unprepared for the white man's world while still stripping away their Indianness. This left boarding school students stuck in a no-man's land between the two cultures, belonging to neither. Zitkala-Sa was dismissed from Carlisle in 1901 after a conflict with Superintendent Pratt. She resented his rigid, military-like program of assimilation. After her dismissal, she published an article in Harper's Monthly describing the profound loss of identity felt by a Native American boy after undergoing the assimilationist education at Carlisle. Zitkala-Sa went on to have a prolific and important writing career. Her later books were among the first works to bring traditional Native American stories to a widespread English-speaking readership. She has been noted as one of the most influential Native American activists of the 20th century. Her most famous book, titled American Indian Stories, is a collection of childhood stories, fiction, and essays, including several of her articles that were originally published in Harper's Monthly and Atlantic Monthly. These stories tell of the hardships of Native American boarding schools and the ineffectuality of their education. The stories run throughout her life on the Yankton Reservation, her years as a student at White's Manual Labor Institute, and her time teaching at Carlisle Indian Industrial School. Beyond her book publications, Zitkala-Sa also became the literary editor of the American Indian magazine and a political writer. With the help of the Indians' Rights Association, in 1923, Zitkala-Sa helped publish Oklahoma's Poor Rich Indians. This was her most explicit political writing, which ended up influencing Congress to pass the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. This encouraged tribes to reestablish self-governance, including management of their own lands.
It's true that some individual people, Indian people, did benefit from the boarding school process, but I think with those benefits came a really high price. And if you look at Zitkala-Sa at the end of her book, she is deeply mourning the loss of her connection to her mother and to her people. Even though she spent the rest of her life working for Indian people, she had lost something that she could never recoup. So even the good things came at a price.
Zitkala-Sa was hated by boarding school administrators, as she saw how the curriculum was meant to teach students how to be good servants for white men. As both a student and a teacher at boarding schools, she took the curriculum far beyond that, teaching herself proficient English and teaching her students about their native culture. Zitkala-Sa died in 1938 in Washington, D.C., and is buried in Arlington National Cemetery under her missionary given first name and married last name, Gertrude Simmons Bonin. Zitkala-Sa's legacy lives on in her literary works and the drastic effects she had on the course of Native American history. While the early Native American boarding schools of the 19th century represent a tragic moment in our nation's history, these schools still allowed Zitkala-Sa, among others, to acquire the English language and use this for the good of their people and the preservation of their culture. Zitkala-Sa represents the epitome of using language and literature for empowerment.